He didn't have a laptop, no teacher, no idea what combinatorial algebra even was. But on a windy afternoon, he drew a map on an old wooden board, and the entire world of mathematics had to stop and look. Lawn Ridge, Illinois. A place even the wind forgets, though it sits stubbornly on the map like a freckle on the wrinkled face of America. Just a few hundred souls live there. The wind blows strong year-round, and behind a half-collapsed barn on an old, no longer working farm lives a boy named Eli Ward, 15 years old, short-cropped hair, cheeks browned by sun, and eyes quiet like earth after a long rain. Eli doesn't own a phone. There's no Wi-Fi at home, no cable, no modern heater. At night, the only light is a flickering ceiling bulb that buzzes like an old porch light trying not to die. He lives with his grandfather, Marvin Ward, a retired Marine who lost half his right knee in the Gulf War, along with most of his trust in government. In the kitchen, next to a Farm Bureau calendar stuck on 2007, hangs an old wooden chalkboard. Marvin says he used it to learn arithmetic in the one-room schoolhouse decades ago. Eli? He drags it to the barn when the chores are done and uses it to draw with a piece of white chalk, one of the last left in a dusty old box. He doesn't know the names of what he draws. He doesn't need to. He just knows there's something calming, sacred, even, about watching straight lines meet in a way that feels right. In a world full of mess and noise, it gives him peace to draw something clean, something silent, and something true. Eli sits cross-legged on the wooden floor. The board rests on two logs. Wind hisses through the cracks in the barn like a harmonica. He sketches a mesh of triangles, then starts coloring the points. Red, blue, yellow, orange, purple. One by one, slowly, carefully. He checks every connection, making sure no two nearby points share a color. His grandfather passes by, raising an eyebrow. "Making your maps again?" Eli nods. He never called them maps, but Marvin did, probably because Eli kept mumbling things like, "These two are too close," and "No, that one needs to change." What neither of them knew was that Eli was gently feeling his way toward a problem no one had solved in over 60 years. A problem grown-ups in universities called the Hadwiger-Nelson problem. A puzzle from the field of geometry and graph theory, too abstract for most college seniors. When Eli was 8, he started noticing the trees behind the house. If two stood close, he imagined they were neighbors who argued too much, so they needed to be painted different colors. That was his first brush with the idea of conflict, not through lectures but through pure observation. As he grew, his models became more complex. Still the same chalkboard, still just one piece of chalk. But now he started carving up the plane, dividing space into regions so that no two shared the same color, even when side by side. Many summer nights, Marvin couldn't find Eli. He'd walk out to the barn and see the boy slumped asleep beside a web of white lines, hexagons folded into triangles, points numbered in fading chalk. An empty soda can beside him, and a notebook filled with tiny paper triangles colored with red pencil. Eli had never been to a library, never read a proper math textbook. Everything he knew came from discarded school materials, old lesson plans, moldy teacher's guides, torn-up test sheets he salvaged from cardboard boxes behind the farmer's market. One day, he found a test dated 1983, 11th grade. A single question stuck with him. What is the minimum number of colors needed to paint every point in a plane so that no 2 points exactly 1 unit apart are the same color? He didn't understand the full question, but he remembered the number 1 and the word minimum. That night he started trying to do it himself. Color a mess of points with the fewest colors possible, making sure none 1 unit apart shared the same color. He had no idea he was grappling with the Hadwiger-Nelson problem. No idea he was tiptoeing through a forest of mathematical thorns that even professional mathematicians tread carefully through. No latex, no graph theory, no fancy notation, just quiet instinct and a curiosity that had never once been broken. Marvin didn't talk much, but every morning he'd brew coffee and watch Eli mark up the board. One time he asked, "What's the point of all this, son?" Eli didn't even look up. "So they don't fight." Marvin chuckled, thinking the boy was joking. But he wasn't. That quiet answer, spoken without flair, is perhaps the purest way anyone's ever described the purpose behind Hodwigger Nelson, making sure every point in a space can exist without conflict, even when close. No one in Lawn Ridge ever asked why the boy played with chalk. Folks were busy with corn prices, machinery, and who wrecked their truck on the state road. But in that half-fallen barn, a child was brushing against something scholars in Cambridge and Palo Alto had failed to touch. And the boy had no clue. Didn't matter. Because Eli Ward only wanted one thing: to make sure every point, no matter how close to its neighbor, had room to breathe in peace, even if it took 5 colors and 100 tries. Even if no one ever noticed. The corn was tall that year, taller than usual. The wind rippled through the field like fingers dragging through dry hair. The road that ran past Lawn Ridge was narrow and barely paved, the kind of road not even Google Maps dares to trust. Somewhere along mile marker 12, a silver Subaru slowed to a crawl, then stopped altogether. Professor Thomas Beckett, age 63, was squinting at the map spread across the passenger seat. He didn't trust GPS, not out here in what he called God's silence. He had been on his way from Iowa City to Peoria for a funeral. A friend, fellow mathematician once known for his work in topology, now reduced to a line in the obituary column. Beckett had taken a wrong turn, or maybe 3, and found himself surrounded by miles of corn and the humming of things that didn't care who you were. He stepped out of the car, adjusted his tweed jacket, yes, he still wore those, and stretched a back that had grown stiff from the drive and stiffer from age. The heat wrapped around him like an old wool blanket left out too long in a shed. He wiped sweat from his brow and looked around. Off to the right, just beyond the ditch, was a small, weathered farm. No cattle, no crops. Just a collapsed windmill and a rusted mailbox with the name Ward half erased by time. He needed water. And maybe, though he didn't say it out loud, he needed something else. Something to break the feeling that time had folded in on itself. He walked toward the barn. The barn door creaked open with a long, reluctant groan. Inside, the light filtered through loose wooden slats, carving stripes across dust and old hay. Beckett paused at the threshold. There, hunched over a chalkboard, was a boy. No shoes, jeans torn at the knee, a quiet stillness to him, like someone deep in prayer, or deep in thought, which sometimes is the same thing. The boy didn't look up. Beckett took one slow step forward. On the floor, beside the boy, lay a set of hand-drawn diagrams that stopped the professor in his tracks. Hexagons, triangles, point lattices, colored nodes. And in the middle of one sketch, a nearly perfect circular slice of the Euclidean plane, partitioned into regions so that no 2 neighboring nodes were the same color, and none less than 5 colors used. He blinked. No labels, no equations, just structure, color, geometry. It was intuitive, yes, but not random. He stepped closer. The boy finally looked up. There was no fear in his eyes, just the mild inconvenience of being interrupted. Beckett cleared his throat. "Do you live here?" The boy nodded. "I got lost," Beckett said. "I was hoping for some water." The boy pointed to a rusty spigot just outside the barn. "It still works." Beckett followed the boy's finger, then paused. "May I ask," he said slowly, turning back, What you're working on? The boy looked at his board, shrugged. Just trying to color it so none of the dots that are too close have the same color. Beckett's breath hitched. He stepped forward, closer now. Do you know what this is? He asked, unable to keep the tremble out of his voice. The boy looked down at his drawing. No, he said. It's just something I do when I'm bored. Thomas Becket hadn't felt this sensation in years, that subtle trembling in the back of the neck. Not fear, not joy, something else. Recognition. For 30 years, he had studied spatial graphs. He had taught undergraduate courses on geometric partitioning. He had given lectures on the infamous Hadwiger-Nelson problem, a deceptively simple question in graph theory. What is the minimum number of colors needed to color all points on a flat plane, so that no 2 points exactly 1 unit apart share the same color? The best minds had long narrowed it down to somewhere between 4 and 7. Some models held at 7. A few breakthroughs had brought it to 6. The dream was 5. But no one, not anyone credible, had managed to generate a clean, bounded, intuitive 5-color partition for an irregular, continuous slice of the Euclidean plane. Not without computer algorithms. And never with this kind of visual clarity. He knelt beside the chalkboard. He didn't touch it, just stared. You drew this by hand? The boy nodded. It's just chalk. Becket looked up at him. What's your name? Eli, the boy said. Eli Ward. Becket smiled, soft and distant, like he had just found a note tucked into a library book from his youth. Well, Eli, he said, voice shaking slightly. You may have just redrawn a question that's haunted people for most of a century. Eli tilted his head, a little confused. It's not a question, he said. It's just a game I play. I imagine the dots are people. If they live too close, they need different colors so they don't fight. Becket closed his eyes for a moment. That was it. That was the question. Dressed down, undressed, made pure again. Not an academic challenge, not a lecture hall trophy. A child's question, hiding in a man's puzzle. They sat in the barn for nearly half an hour. Becket asked to take photos. Eli shrugged. It'll wipe off soon anyway, he said. The professor drank from the spigot, wiped his mouth, and looked again at the name on the mailbox. He knew he would return. More than that, he knew he had just seen something important. Not just for math. For how knowledge survives. Not in lecture halls, not in digital archives, but in a boy with no internet, no guidance, no fancy words, only a chalkboard, and a need to make things peaceful. Becket stepped back into his car and drove away. But before he merged back onto the road, he opened his laptop and uploaded one of the photos, just the chalkboard drawing, no names, to a quiet little corner of the internet. A math forum, polymath discussion thread, no caption, no credit, just a question. Unknown farm kid, 5-color partition, hand-drawn. Anyone else seeing what I'm seeing? Eli Ward had never heard of Hadwiger, or Nelson, or the 50 years of ink-stained papers written about the space between 2 dots. He didn't know that the thing he had sketched with chalk, barefoot, half asleep in an Illinois barn, was the same thing a professor once presented to the Clay Mathematics Institute with a trembling voice and a failed proof. He just thought it looked better when no 2 neighbors had the same color. In Eli's world, there were no unit distances, no chromatic bounds, no Euclidean partitions. There were only dots. Some were too close. Some needed space. And colors, if you chose them right, helped keep the peace. That was all. But in Professor Becket's world, the drawing now sat, quietly, anonymously, on a math forum called Polymath, where mathematicians from across the world tossed ideas like breadcrumbs into the dark. Most threads died quietly. A few sparked. But this one lit up like dry grass under lightning. The first reply came from a PhD student in Tel Aviv. Looks like a variation of Ghulam's 6-color attempt, but cleaner partition boundaries. Who is this? Then a quiet voice from Stanford. Hold on. In configuration C3, is that a 5-color adjacency with no violation? The replies came faster now. Questions, screenshots, digital reconstructions, people trying to redraw the shape on their own machines, entering coordinates, running unit tests between nodes. Someone wrote, "This isn't computer-generated? Who the hell is unknown farm kid?" Back in Lawn Ridge, Eli was in the barn, scraping yesterday's chalk from the board, unaware that his sketch had traveled farther than anyone in his family ever had. He was thinking about making the edges of his hexagons more rounded today, just for fun. He liked the way the colors flowed better when nothing felt sharp. He didn't know the world was watching. Professor Beckett didn't return for 3 days. He told himself he needed time, needed to be sure, needed to verify. In truth, he was afraid. Afraid that if he returned too quickly, he might break something. That somehow, by naming it, labeling it, studying it, he would crush the very thing that made it special. But mathematics, real mathematics, has always had room for beauty, and beauty, once recognized, refuses to stay silent. So on the 4th day, just after sunrise, Beckett's Subaru came rumbling up the gravel road again. He stepped out with a small box under one arm and a tremble in his hands he hadn't felt since graduate school. Eli was already in the barn. "You came back," the boy said, as if it were the most natural thing. "I did," Beckett smiled. "I brought you something." He opened the box. Inside, a handful of thick paper, a plastic compass, a straight edge, colored pencils sorted neatly by shade, and a slim, battered book. Eli looked at it like someone might look at a mirror after a long illness. "What is it?" he asked, picking up the book. "Something old," Beckett said, "but it talks about the same kind of games you play." Eli flipped through the yellowed pages, graphs, dots, distance, coloring, then the name, Hadwiger-Nelson problem. He frowned. "I didn't know it had a name." Beckett sat beside him. "Most beautiful things do," he said. "We just don't always learn them in school." They spent the morning drawing together. Eli's fingers, so used to chalk, took quickly to the pencil. His grip was different, softer, less pressure. Beckett showed him how to measure distances exactly 1 unit apart. They redrew the original sketch, this time more carefully. Eli watched as Beckett labeled points, A1, A2, B1, B2. The boy didn't care for the labels. "Feels like we're giving them numbers just to boss them around," he said. Beckett laughed. "I suppose you're right." Still, they kept going. They built a partition across the page, 5 colors as before. Beckett ran his finger along one edge. "No violations," he said softly. "Still holds." Eli nodded. "You don't need to check every time. I can feel it when it's wrong." Beckett turned to him, surprised. "Feel it?" The boy shrugged. "It's like, if 2 colors sit too close, it buzzes, in my head, like the colors are arguing." Beckett looked at him a long time. "You're not solving this the way most people do." Eli looked back down at the page. "I'm not most people." That evening, Beckett stood in the kitchen with Marvin, the grandfather. He explained carefully that Eli's drawings had stirred something real in the mathematics community, that some people were calling it a breakthrough, at the very least, a contribution worth studying. Marvin listened, arms crossed. "So, what do you want from him?" he asked flatly. Beckett hesitated. Nothing, except to make sure he's not ignored. Marvin nodded, slowly. Then poured the professor a cup of coffee. You know, he said, when Eli was little, he used to separate the green beans on his plate so they didn't touch the mashed potatoes. Said they were arguing when they got too close. Beckett smiled. Looks like he never stopped. Back in the barn, Eli sat alone with the book open on his lap. He didn't understand most of it. The Greek letters danced like moths on the page. Terms like chromatic number, unit distance graph, non-measurable sets. None of it felt like the game he played. But somewhere near the back of the book was a photo, a diagram of a 7-color plane filled with dots, dense and sterile. Eli looked at it, then at his own paper. His had curves, breathing space, color that felt alive. He didn't know the rules, but he knew how to listen. And to him, every point was still a person, and every color, a kind of kindness. The internet doesn't usually go quiet. Not the parts Beckett visited, anyway. Message boards full of unfinished proofs, arguments about prime gaps, pixelated debates on conjectures older than the Cold War. But the thread he posted, marked only by the image of Eli's chalkboard titled Unknown Farm Kid, 5-color attempt, sat untouched for nearly 2 days. And in mathematics, silence can mean many things. It can mean disbelief. It can mean confusion. It can also mean awe. Eli didn't know there was a thread. He was still in the barn, testing another variation, this time with curved edges, like rivers between neighbors, he said. He didn't know the word Voronoi, but he had reinvented it anyway. He didn't know that in a physics lab in the Netherlands, a doctoral candidate had printed out his drawing and pinned it to the wall above her terminal. Or that a retired professor in Kyoto had spent the entire night running discrete unit tests on the shape, cross-checking it against every known configuration published since 1981. He didn't know that, for the first time in years. Several researchers had quietly changed the way they described the Hadwiger-Nelson problem in lecture notes, from unsolved curiosity to currently under reinterpretation. What Eli did know was that the sun felt warmer that morning, and that the blue chalk ran smoother when the board was cold. He also knew, without being told, that the new shape he had drawn the night before had a flaw, one small corner where 2 points sat just a bit too close, where the orange and red would start to argue. So he erased it. Without hesitation, without regret, and began again. On the third night, the silence broke. The first post came from an anonymous user tagged only Stanford42. If this is hand-drawn, then this kid has intuitively replicated a graph partition that mimics a 5 chromatic fractional tiling across a non-repeating node set. That's not possible, a professor from Toronto replied. He didn't replicate. He invented it. And it's not fractional. Look at the adjacency overlay. Those are hard lines, not probability zones. Then a third from an IP address traced to a think tank in Zurich. Impossible or not, the configuration works. I can't find a single unit distance violation. Who is this? But Beckett still hadn't named him. He had been watching quietly, the way old monks might listen to the forest after prayer. He didn't respond to the messages. He didn't offer context. Not yet. Let the drawings speak first, he thought. Let them wrestle with the silence. Meanwhile, in the barn, Eli was building a new kind of tiling, this one shaped like uneven petals. He called them whispers. Each segment curved away from its neighbor, like leaves giving space to light. He didn't measure, he just listened. Too close, he'd whisper, erasing. Better, he'd murmur, adjusting. He had no idea that his whispers were forming an irregular tessellation, a concept that would, decades ago, have sparked its own branch of inquiry. He had never studied topology, but his hands moved like someone who had once dreamt it in another life. Beckett finally responded on day 4. A short post. No fanfare. The boy's name is Eli Ward. He's 15. He lives in a town with more corn than books. He's never heard of Hadwiger or Nelson. But he's been playing this game since he was 8. He didn't need a theorem to guide him. He just didn't want the colors to fight. Silence again. Then, slowly, reverently, comments began to appear, from mathematicians who had stopped publishing, from retired engineers, from a hospice nurse who had once majored in math but had left it behind. He made the math feel kind again. My daughter cried when she saw the drawing. She said it looked like the houses in her dream. Tell Eli, thank you. That weekend, Beckett printed out the entire thread and drove back to Lawn Ridge. He found Eli in the barn, as always. Chalk dust on his sleeves, bare feet smudged gray from the floor. Beckett handed him the printouts, 30 pages thick, stapled into a crooked bundle. Eli held them like something fragile. These people, Beckett said, they've been talking about your drawing. Eli flipped through the pages, quietly, thoughtfully, then paused at a message written in bold, blocky font, from someone who had only written once. I've been chasing this problem for 15 years. I thought maybe I wasn't smart enough to solve it, but now I think maybe I just wasn't quiet enough to hear it. Eli smiled. They don't need to thank me, he said. The colors were just waiting for someone to ask nicely. That night, Beckett stayed for dinner. Marvin grilled pork chops. Eli made a salad out of the only things growing in the yard, some wild greens, a few late tomatoes, and a handful of mint. They ate in silence. Not awkward silence. The kind of silence that happens when the world doesn't need to be explained, only witnessed. Afterward, Eli walked Beckett to his car. Will you keep sharing them? The boy asked. Beckett nodded. If you'll keep drawing them. Eli looked up at the stars, small and scattered, but not arguing. I will, he said, until I run out of colors. By the end of that week, the internet wanted a name. Not just a first name. A face, a photo, a story. The math forums had done what math forums rarely do. They crossed over. A quiet thread from Polymath had been screen captured, reposted on Twitter by an academic in London, then picked up by a science blog called The Quiet Proof. From there, it leapt to Reddit, where it sat for 2 days on the front page under the title, This 15-year-old farm kid may have just changed our understanding of spatial coloring. No one could quite say what had happened. It wasn't a solved problem, not yet. But something had shifted. The drawing was real, the configuration held, and it hadn't come from MIT or Caltech. It had come from a barn, from a boy. But who? Beckett received 3 emails the next morning from 3 different journalists, then 2 from YouTube math channels, then 1, unexpectedly, from a professor at Cambridge who once openly mocked visual intuition in mathematics, now asking, in a noticeably humbled tone, whether the young man would be open to discussing his method in an informal seminar. Beckett deleted the first 5 messages, replied only to the 6th. The boy is not looking for interviews. He is not a story. He is a student of silence. Let him draw. Still, the pressure built. A group of grad students created a Discord server titled Ward Coloring. Within 24 hours, it had over 2,000 members. A subreddit formed. People began posting their own hand-drawn partitions, inspired by the chalkboard photo. Children from Iowa, Turkey, and the Philippines uploaded photos of chalk diagrams on sidewalks, schoolyard walls, and bedroom floors. Someone wrote in blue crayon, "No 2 dots should fight. Signed, age 7. Back in Lawn Ridge, Eli felt none of this. He was working on a new series, He called them weather maps. He didn't mean temperature. He meant moods. Each node was shaded not by color but by softness, how tense it felt when he stared at it. He had begun shading edges now, too, using the side of the chalk to soften the line, making some look like shadows instead of borders. When Beckett visited that evening, Eli didn't even look up from the board. "They're starting to ask who you are," Beckett said. "I didn't ask them to." "I know." Silence. Then after a while, Eli said, "I'm not a secret. I just don't want to become loud." Beckett sat down, placed a folded paper on the floor beside him. "It's already loud out there, but you don't have to speak over it. You just have to stay still." Eli nodded. "I can do that." The next day, a journalist showed up, not on invitation. He drove a rented car with a New York plate, wore loafers unsuited for gravel, and held a microphone he never got to use. Marvin Ward met him at the edge of the property. The man began his pitch. Human interest, young genius, rural wonder. But Marvin didn't flinch. No cameras, no stories. He's got enough on his board. The reporter offered money. Marvin offered silence. In the end, it was the same thing. Meanwhile, something odd happened online. A group of academics, some jealous, some skeptical, began pushing back. One Twitter thread read, "We have no evidence that this farm kid exists. This could be a hoax, or worse, some kind of AI-generated trolling." Another, more pointed, "There is a dangerous romanticization of outsider intellect happening. Mathematics is not coloring books." And finally, from an account labeled Math Realism 1972, "Until proven otherwise, this is feel-good nonsense from the internet's echo chamber." Beckett read the comments quietly. He understood the fear. For some, it was fear of losing control of the conversation. For others, it was the deeper fear that someone, somewhere, without credentials or grants or published papers, might have seen the truth first. That night, Eli asked a question. "Why do they want to know my name so badly?" Beckett thought for a while, then answered, "Because they want to believe you're real." "I am." "I know." "Then why don't they just listen to the drawing?" Beckett smiled, sad. "Because most people don't listen until they know who's talking." Eli went back to his chalkboard. This time he began with only 2 points. He stared at them for a long time, then drew a single line between them. Thin, careful, quiet. Then he set down the chalk. "Maybe," he said, "they can just listen to this." A week later, Beckett published a paper, not on behalf of himself, but on behalf of a concept. The title was simple: Partitioning Kindness, on the Unnamed Geometry of Peaceful Coloring. It contained no author name, no institutional affiliation, just a scan of Eli's first drawing and a short paragraph. This model, created without formal training, exhibits properties long sought after by those of us trained in proof. It reminds us that the space between points is not just a measure of distance, but of potential, and that perhaps the purest mathematics comes not from conquest, but from care. The community responded in silence, then slowly, with reverence. Someone reposted it with a caption: "Not every theorem needs to shout. Some just need to whisper long enough to be heard." The invitation came in the form of a white envelope, thick paper, official seal embossed in gold. It arrived by mail, not email. Addressed simply to Mr. Eli Ward, Co. Marvin Ward, Lawn Ridge, Illinois. Inside was a folded letter, signed by the chair of the American Mathematical Society. The handwriting, though printed, carried the weight of someone who had spent their life speaking through symbols. It read, We would be honored to welcome the author of the so-called Ward partitioning to present at our upcoming annual gathering in Chicago. No formal talk required, simply to attend and, if willing, share a few thoughts. Eli read the letter twice, then handed it to Marvin without a word. His grandfather stared at the words for a long time, then said, "Well, guess I better wash that old shirt." They took the bus. 2 hours to Peoria, another 3 to Chicago. Marvin packed sandwiches, wrapped in wax paper. Eli brought his chalkboard, strapped to his back with rope like a farmer hauling lumber. They didn't talk much on the ride. Marvin watched the cornfields turn to parking lots. Eli watched the lines on the road and wondered if they, too, were fighting to stay in their lanes. The venue was too big. High ceilings, glass walls, badges that blinked when you checked in. People with blazers, name tags, coffee that cost more than Eli had ever spent in a week. Beckett met them at the entrance. He wore a tie but no jacket. When he saw Eli, he smiled like a man finding his compass again. "You came," he said. "I said I would," Eli answered, adjusting the board on his back. Beckett gestured toward the auditorium. "No one's expecting a speech, but if you want, I've saved you a chair." Eli looked at the room through the glass. It was full, but quiet. The program had listed it simply as 3:45 p.m. A coloring problem, presented by E. Ward, informal. There were no slides, no projector. No microphone, just a wooden easel and a small table with chalk. Eli stepped onto the stage like a boy entering someone else's house. He didn't look up right away. He unpacked his board, set it gently on the stand, and began to draw. No words, just movement. The way a tree leans into the light without asking permission. One by one, he drew the same configuration. The 5-color field he had created a year ago, then erased, then remade again last spring. The audience, professors, students, editors, skeptics, all watched. Some leaned forward, others closed their laptops. When he finished, he turned the board to face them. Then finally, he spoke. His voice wasn't strong, but it didn't need to be. "I think when dots are too close, they argue. So I try to give each dot a little space. Not too much. Just enough to be themselves without hurting the others. I don't know what it's called, but I call it peace." He stepped back. That was all. He didn't wait for questions, didn't ask if it was good. He just stepped down, walked back to his seat, and sat beside Marvin, who handed him half a sandwich. The room stayed silent, not because they were unimpressed, but because sometimes words ruin what's already whole. Beckett later described it like this: "It was the most precise lecture I've ever witnessed, spoken in fewer words than a grocery list." A professor from MIT whispered to her colleague, "He didn't explain the solution. He became the solution." Someone in the back wept quietly, though they weren't sure why. That night, Eli didn't attend the reception. He and Marvin took the elevator to the hotel rooftop, looked out over the glowing city, and split the last sandwich between them. Eli pointed to the streets below. "So many lights," he said. Marvin nodded. "Think they're fighting?" Eli shrugged. "Not if they're far enough apart." They sat in silence, wrapped in the hum of a city that, for once, didn't need to understand. Just listen. They started calling it Ward partitioning. Not officially, not yet. But the name took hold like seeds in dry soil, carried by wind and quiet curiosity. At first it was just shorthand, a way for academics on forums and email chains to refer to the drawing, the method, the arrangement. But over time, the phrase hardened, gained weight, left echoes. Not because Eli had claimed anything, but because no one else could explain what he had done. After the Chicago gathering, a professor from Princeton requested permission to test the model. His specialty was discrete geometry, and he had been one of the earliest skeptics. His name was Dr. Anton L. Ree, known for rejecting intuition in favor of computable rigor. He emailed Beckett. "We'd like to reconstruct the Ward configuration using formal adjacency testing. Would the boy be willing to submit a clean vector version?" Beckett relayed the message. Eli didn't answer right away. He spent the afternoon redrawing the pattern by hand, not tracing, not copying, just letting it grow again, from the first 2 points outward. When it was finished, he handed it to Beckett without a word. Beckett mailed it. On paper, not email. Ree scanned it into his lab system. 3 postdocs began the analysis. They expected to find gaps, small violations, a mistake buried deep in the edges. Instead, they found something else, a configuration that, within its boundaries, never allowed 2 points exactly 1 unit apart to share a color, even in irregular densities. A non-periodic finite tiling of the plane, using only 5 colors, with no chromatic bleeding and no need for complex computational sorting. Not an approximation, not a suggestion, a construction, not flawless, not universal, but real and new. Word spread, not in headlines, but in lunchrooms, not in journals, but in margin notes. Graduate students whispered it over vending machines. "Have you seen the 5th color proof? They're calling it Ward now. It feels different." What made it different wasn't just the minimal number, though 5 was tantalizing. It was the method, the lack of method. There were no equations, no set theory scaffolding, no matrix reductions, only spatial intuition. Some called it art, some called it luck, but most agreed it worked. Back in Lawn Ridge, Eli didn't know any of this. He had moved on to new patterns, these ones less about color, more about distance. He called them sleeps. Each point had a number, not a color. The number represented how long it could stay quiet before it had to speak. The higher the number, the more time it had to be left alone. He drew them in loops, letting the quiet ones rest far from the noisy ones. To an outsider, it looked like nothing. To a mathematician, it resembled early-stage modeling of temporal graph theory. To Eli, it was just a game, a way to make the loud parts of the world behave more gently. When Beckett told him about the confirmation, about Ree's lab, the analysis, the term Ward partitioning, Eli didn't react. He just said, "5 feels right." Beckett nodded. "It does." Eli added, "But I wouldn't use 6, even if it worked better. 6 argues too much with red." Beckett didn't ask what that meant. He had learned by now. When Eli talked like that, it was best to just listen. Some truths don't need proof. They just need a pause. That spring, the American Journal of Mathematical Structures published a brief note in their findings section. The configuration commonly referred to as Ward partitioning appears to present a novel 5-color mapping over a finite non-periodic plane graph with unit distance exclusions. While not a general solution to the Hadwiger-Nelson problem, it introduces a verified structure previously undocumented in mathematical literature. Further study recommended. It was the first time Eli's name appeared in print. He didn't know. He was in the barn, drawing new sleep maps, adding a 6th number he called the ghost number. It meant only speak when no one is listening. One night, Beckett found a letter in his inbox from a school in New Mexico. A teacher had started using Eli's drawings as inspiration for a geometry club. Kids who hated math suddenly loved colors. They didn't know it was a partition. They just knew that every point needed a little space. Inside the envelope was a folded piece of paper, a child's drawing, 5 dots, 5 colors, no overlaps, and written in crayon, a sentence. This one is for the quiet dot. Beckett mailed it to Eli. When Eli opened it, he didn't smile. He just stared. Then walked to the board, drew a new pattern, small, simple, almost invisible, and beside it, in tiny letters, he wrote, Color 5. Not because it was his, but because it asked nothing in return. Spring came late to Lawn Ridge. The trees hesitated. The soil stayed cold. But somewhere between the last frost and the first sprout, Eli decided something quietly, the way he always did. He wasn't going. Not to Harvard, not to Princeton, not even to the special boarding school in Ohio that sent him a glossy brochure with photos of green quads and dorm rooms nicer than most homes. Each envelope arrived the same way, large, thick, respectful. Each one was gently set aside. Beckett visited one afternoon, leaned against the barn wall, and asked the question everyone else was thinking. "You're sure?" Eli nodded, eyes still on the chalk. "They're good places," Beckett said. "You'd learn a lot." "I'm still learning," Eli said. "From who?" Eli smiled faintly. "From the quiet." That summer, Eli and Marvin cleared out the old cattle barn. The hay bales were moved, the cobwebs brushed, the windows unnailed for the first time in 20 years. Marvin installed a fan. Eli painted the inside walls chalkboard black, one panel at a time. Beckett donated a box of colored chalks, real ones, soft and slow, not the brittle kind sold in bulk. No desks. Just wide wooden tables made from scrap doors, sanded by hand, legs bolted in with mismatched screws. Kids began to come. First, just 2. The neighbor's boy and his cousin. Then 5. Then 10. Some barefoot. Some shy. All curious. Eli didn't call it a school. He just called it the coloring barn. There were no bells, no tests, no chairs in rows. The only rule, no one erases someone else's work. Eli didn't teach in the usual way. He gave each kid a blank board and said, "Draw something where the dots don't fight." Most of them stared. Then slowly a line would appear, then a shape, then color. When someone asked, "Is this math?" Eli would answer, "If it's quiet and makes sense and doesn't hurt anyone, then maybe, yes." The barn began to change, not quickly, but noticeably. The beams still creaked, but now they echoed with laughter. Chalk dust coated everything, like snow that never melted. Kids who once hated school started showing up early, and leaving with hands stained in blue, green, orange. Someone brought muffins. Someone else brought folding chairs. A retired shop teacher donated a box of rulers from 1963. One grandmother dropped off 2 thermoses of sweet tea every Thursday, with a note that read, "For the boy who made my grandson care again." Eli never took attendance, never assigned grades. But every so often, he would walk past a child's board, pause, and whisper, "That's a very good distance." The kids began to repeat the phrase to each other, not fully understanding it, but sensing it mattered. A good distance, not too close, not too far, just enough to stay friends. By fall, a group of local parents asked if Eli would consider making it official. A program, a curriculum, maybe even accreditation. Eli looked at the papers, then looked at the barn, then shook his head. "If it becomes official, someone will build a gate." Marvin laughed when he heard that. "No gates, no uniforms, that's the whole point." So it stayed what it was, a chalk-covered barn on the edge of a forgotten town, where kids came not to compete but to color, not to memorize, but to listen. One chilly morning, Beckett showed up with a gift. A small brass plaque. Eli didn't want a sign, but Beckett insisted. Together they nailed it above the barn door. It read, "The Ward Coloring Barn, Est, by Eli Ward, age 15. Where the only rule is, no two dots should fight." Eli stared at it for a long time, then said, "Shouldn't it say points instead of dots?" Beckett smiled. "Not here." That winter, a girl from 3 counties over made a perfect 6-color loop with no repeats, without knowing what a loop was. A boy who never spoke in school invented a tessellation no one could replicate. And every afternoon, Marvin brought cocoa in old ceramic mugs, muttering, "This ain't a cafe," while topping off each one. The barn never asked who you were, only how gently you held the chalk. It was bound to happen. Not everyone loved what Eli had done. For every quiet message of wonder, there was a louder voice behind a podium, holding a pen like a sword, ready to correct the myth before it spread too far. And this time, the voice came from a place of reputation. Dr. Wallace Penfield, tenured MIT, author of Rigorous Colorings, The Science of Spatial Certainty, known for 3 things: precision, provocation, and disdain for sentimental math. He delivered the keynote at a conference in Boston that fall. The title of his talk? On the Dangers of Pastel Mathematics, a critique of the Ward phenomenon. The room was full. He began by showing a photo of Eli's original chalkboard diagram. Grainy, hand-drawn, uneven. Then he raised an eyebrow. "This," he said, "is what happens when we trade proofs for poetry." A few in the audience chuckled. A few didn't. He continued, "I do not question the intentions of the boy, nor do I doubt the emotional power of a child coloring in a barn. But this is not mathematics. It is sentimentality, masquerading as structure. The Hadwiger-Nelson problem does not yield to whim. It yields to logic." He clicked through slides of formal partitions. Neat, algorithmic, computer-verified. There is no equation behind this Ward partition, no formal method, no reproducible pathway. He looked at the audience. And that is not beauty. That is accident. The room was silent, not in agreement, not in protest, just unsure. The clip circulated online, posted, reposted, quoted. Some called it brave. Others called it bitter. But one comment, buried beneath hundreds, simply read, "He forgot that chalk thinks too." It was a line that would return again and again in weeks to come, printed on stickers, written on sidewalks, etched into the corner of a new math club's whiteboard in Vermont. Chalk thinks too. Back in Lawn Ridge, Eli didn't watch the speech. He was repairing a broken corner of the barn roof, patching it with tin and quiet. Beckett called him about it, unsure whether to explain. Eli listened, then asked, "Is he mad at me?" "No," Beckett said. "He's mad at what you remind him of." "What's that?" "That he once believed in beauty first." Eli nodded. "I don't mind." 2 days later, a package arrived at MIT, unmarked, no return address. Inside, one piece of thick paper. No letter, no note. Just a hand-drawn coloring. 5 colors, labeled only with soft pencil. Edges clean, symmetrical, flawless. At the bottom, in handwriting small and plain, not an argument, just a drawing. EW. Somewhere along the line, something shifted. Penfield never responded publicly, but 3 months later, he revised the preface of his next edition. The sentence added, "Even the hand-drawn partition, if consistent, deserves to be studied. For if we ignore intuition, we forget where mathematics began, not in systems, but in sketches." Eli didn't know. He was busy helping a 6-year-old figure out how to color a loop of dots without using the same shade twice. The girl bit her lip. "They're all too close." Eli leaned in, pointed to one dot, and said, "Try giving that one more room. Sometimes things just need a little space." The girl tried again. This time, it worked. She beamed. He smiled. And outside, the wind lifted a little dust off the chalkboards lining the barn. Tiny particles of white, floating in late afternoon sun, like something thinking. On Eli Ward's 16th birthday, it snowed. Just a light dusting, barely enough to cover the brittle grass behind the barn, but it was snow all the same, the kind that made sound disappear and breath feel warmer. Inside the coloring barn, 23 kids sat around the long wooden tables, chalk in hand, faces bent over boards, drawing. Some drew circles. Some made shapes they didn't know the names of. One girl, age 7, drew 2 dots with a heart between them and said, "They're not fighting anymore." Eli nodded. "That's the goal." He didn't want a party, but Marvin insisted. So they brought lemonade and cookies. Someone made a crown out of paper and tried to get Eli to wear it. He refused, but smiled. Beckett came, too, in his usual tweed coat, carrying a small envelope. "I have a gift," he said, handing it to Eli. Inside was a letter, written in a child's handwriting, careful and slightly slanted. "Dear Eli, I'm 8. My brother is in the hospital and I don't like going there. But I brought my chalk and I started drawing on the sidewalk. The nurse said the shapes looked peaceful. She sat down and colored with me. I don't know if I did it right, but I used 5 colors, and none of them were mad at each other. Is that okay? Love, MS, Texas." Eli read it twice, then picked up a pencil and wrote back. Short, plain. "There is no right. If your colors stayed kind to each other, then yes. That's better than okay." He handed the letter back to Beckett without fanfare. "Can you send it?" "Of course," Beckett said. That night, after the barn had emptied, Eli stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the snow fall. The fields were silent. The world, for once, had no questions. Only space. Behind him, the chalkboards were covered in patterns, some wild, some precise. A few with notes in the corners, "Don't erase please," or "This one feels calm." Eli added nothing. He just let them stay. At some point that year, without anyone planning it, schools began sending visitors. Not officials, just teachers. They came quietly, sat in the back, took notes. One math teacher from Oregon wept during recess. When asked why, she said, "I've spent 20 years asking kids to be correct, and here, they're just allowed to be curious." No one clapped, but someone handed her a piece of chalk. She sat down and drew. In March, a group of students from a community college published a small paper online titled "Empathy as Constraint: Rethinking Distance in Euclidean Spaces." They dedicated it to the boy who taught us that peace can be drawn. No last name, just the boy. Somewhere in New York, a museum curator requested the original chalkboard for a traveling exhibit on untrained geniuses of the 21st century. Marvin declined. He hung the board in the barn with new brackets, high enough that the kids had to climb a stool to reach it. "It stays here," he said, "right where it started." One afternoon, near the end of summer, Eli asked Beckett, "Do you think the problem's solved?" Beckett thought a long time, then replied, "Not fully, not mathematically, but maybe emotionally." Eli smiled. "That's enough for me." And so the barn stayed. Chalk dust thicker now, boards layered with hundreds of drawings, some colored over, some left untouched. Kids kept coming. Some left, some came back with siblings. And every once in a while, someone, usually quiet, usually new, would ask, "Am I allowed to draw something?" And the answer was always the same. If you have a piece of chalk and something kind to say, you already belong. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening, not just with your ears, but with that quiet part of the heart that still believes in gentle things. If this story moved you, we invite you to subscribe, not for algorithms, not for numbers, but because somewhere out there, another quiet child is holding a piece of chalk, and maybe they need to know someone is watching.